Hey everybody, this is Brian Smith back with an episode of Grief to Growth, and today I've got with me Lee Witting, and Lee is the host of NDE Radio. It's a podcast that he produces for IANDS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. And Lee himself underwent an NDE at age 7 when he drowned in a lake. The experience altered the interests he pursued growing up and influenced his course of undergraduate study at Columbia University. Following graduation, Lee worked for the city of New York as a caseworker in West Harlem, helping the elderly lacking health insurance to get city funding for their hospital stays. Later, Lee, his wife, and 3-year-old son took a freighter to Europe and spent most of a year in a VW camper visiting churches and other sacred spaces in Europe and the Middle East. Returning to the U.S., Lee's family restored gardens in an old farmhouse on the coast of Maine. Studies at Bangor Theological Seminary led Lee to a doctorate in near-death studies, and a 15-year career as a hospital chaplain at Bangor's Eastern Maine Medical Center, from which he recently retired. Lee's about to publish a novel based on NDE insights titled Beneath the Phoenix Door, and is also at work on a guide for chaplains to incorporate NDE stories into their practice. So Lee, I want to welcome you to Grief to Growth, and I appreciate your patience in getting the technology worked out this afternoon.
Well, thank you, Brian. I'm glad we figured it all out. So.
Yeah, it worked out okay. Yeah. So you had an NDE yourself at age 7. Tell me how that went.
I did. All children should learn how to swim was probably the number one lesson to come out of my NDE. But
yeah,
I was wading out. The bottom of the lake dropped off sharply. I should have known that because this was a family cottage and we had been going there since I was an infant. But anyway, I waded out too far. My mother had just gone into the cottage, and I went down. I came up once, screamed. I was terrified, of course. And when I screamed, all the air was out of my lungs, and I sank down to the bottom. However, I suddenly realized that I was up in a birch tree next to the cottage, watching as my mother ran. She did hear my scream. Ran down the stairs, ran down to the shore, dove in. She was changing for church. She was wearing a red dress, dove right in with her dress and everything on, and found my body down in the lake, dragged me out, and threw me face down over a log, and sort of invented CPR. I mean, they didn't know CPR back then, but she, by doing chest or pressing on my back, she said later, trying to get the water out of your lungs, She had that log doing chest compressions and got my heart started again.
Oh, wow.
Meanwhile, I'm up in this tree watching all this, and I could see off to the right and up above, I could see there was another place I could go. I didn't see any beings. I didn't see any angels or relatives or anything like that. But I also saw how upset my mother was, and so I figured I better hang around. And when I thought that thought, I was back in my body. Interestingly enough, for years after that, I had this recurring dream where I felt like I was sinking down in the lake. Felt like I was, there was the light on the surface, the sunlight on the surface of the water, and I was sinking away from it. And it wasn't until I was in my early 20s, I went back to the same lake, dove in to about the same spot, went under the water to see if the stream had any reality to it, and realized that the light on the surface of the lake was spread all over. It wasn't like a pinpoint of light the way I'd imagined it. And going down wasn't this darkness. But later on, years after that, reading about near-death experiences, I thought, well, maybe I had gotten closer to that light than I thought. And maybe the dream I was having was not sinking in the lake, but actually coming back from the light and falling back into my body.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that makes sense, because a lot of times when people do come back, they feel that like backward sensation.
Yes. So after that, I got very interested in NDEs, and ultimately wound up, as you said, going to seminary, getting a doctorate in it, and then using them extensively as a chaplain.
Back at 7, did you talk to anyone about your experience, and did people believe you?
I didn't feel like it was strange at all. I'd been raised in a, typical, it was at the time Presbyterian Sunday school, where everyone, when they die, you leave your body and go to heaven.
Mhm.
So I felt like this was probably a very natural thing. I didn't talk to my mother about it because I felt she would be very upset.
Yeah.
And I didn't talk to anyone about it for years, and which is, as it turns out, is a very common thing with people who have NDEs. Um, but it changed my behavior and my interests quite profoundly. Suddenly, I found I was interested in astronomy, very interested in going out at night. Finally, got my mother to buy me a little reflector telescope, 3.5-inch mirror reflector telescope, and I'd go out and I'd look at the moon and I'd look at the Jupiter and the, what I could see of Saturn, and it was just fascinating to me that there was this immensity that I hadn't even paid any attention to before
Mhm.
in my life. Then I went one step further and built a whole planetarium setup in our attic in our house. Got old cardboard refrigerator boxes and cut them into a skyline. I had lights behind the skyline, like the Hayden Planetarium was my Eden at that time. But I could make the sunrise and the sunset, and with a little, what was essentially a toy projector, I could project the stars on the ceiling. I could have, and then I'd write scripts. I'd have an asteroid or a comet go by. I'd have the end of the world. I'd do all sorts of shows. I'd write the script. My mother was always the audience. She'd come up and lie on the floor on a mattress, and I'd go through the whole thing, and she'd say, "Oh, very, very interestingly," before she went back downstairs. And from there, I just I don't know. I just got more and more interested in spirituality. My mother, by the way, had converted to Catholicism at that point, so I was up against Sunday school with nuns who were adamant that all you had to do to save your soul when you're that age was to memorize your catechism. And so, if I didn't get all of the answers correct, they'd whack me on the back of the hand with a ruler. So I never, like you say, I'm more spiritual than religious. I think
Mhm.
that is probably what put me on that same track that I heard. Well, you've said it. And many of my patients at the hospital would say the same thing. When I'd identify myself as a chaplain, go in and say, "Would you like to talk?" They'll say, "Well, I'm not religious, but I am spiritual." And
Yeah.
we'd get into the most amazing conversations.
Yeah.
But
So you have this experience, and it sounds like you integrated it pretty easily. Because a lot of times children take decades to integrate a near-death experience.
it was integrated, but it wasn't communicable. I couldn't really talk about it back then.
Okay.
But I'd always had a sense that I was born during World War II. I think I must have died in a previous life during World War II, because another recurring dream I had was of getting out of a Jeep ambulance, climbing out of the passenger side on a battlefield, and then a huge explosion. I had that dream many times,
Hmm.
and I talked to a psychic, spiritualist psychic sort of woman one time, and so she did a reading on me, and she said, "Yes, I think you were a doctor." She said, "I don't know if I was a doctor or an EMT, but at any event, she made it seem real to me that I'd gotten out of an ambulance. I was going to help someone on the battlefield, and then just got blown up."
Hmm.
And I assume it was the same war that I got born into. So it must have been a pretty quick transition.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So you eventually ended up going, as you said, you got a doctorate in near-death studies. I didn't know that even exists.
Well, it did briefly.
Okay.
My seminary, which is now out of business, unfortunately, Bangor Theological Seminary, it had been going since 1819 or something like that. I mean, really early. It was congregationally based. Like, congregationalism was very big in the Northeast, especially above Massachusetts, and it had a Doctor of Divinity and a Doctor of Ministry program for years, but I was the last class, and that they were awarding doctorates in, and I had to persuade them. I said, listen, I was already a chaplain. I was already doing this work in the hospital, and I said, these stories are so powerful. They're so hope-giving and life-fulfilling in some cases, because people had terrible fear of death, terrible fear of uh, not only of existing and going to, the bad place, to quote
Yeah.
the reverse of the show on TV, but also just a fear of nothingness, of going into silence and
Yeah.
nothing. And these stories they're very personal. Near-death experience stories are usually quite personalized, even though they're generalities that you can identify with. But those personal stories of visiting family, seeing friends, friendly angels, meeting Jesus, all of these things were so hope-giving, even to people who had no, well, let me say especially to people who had no religious background, had nothing to fall back on when they found themselves dying of cancer, or having just had a heart attack, or, this was a trauma hospital. This was a major hospital, and I dealt with a lot of people and their families who were either dying themselves or losing someone. I'd go to conferences where they'd meet with the doctors, and the doctors would say, "I'm sorry, but there's just no hope." And then they'd leave me with the families that just had completely blown their minds, and then they said, well, "Okay, well, the chaplain will sit with you for a while."
Yeah.
Or trauma cases where someone has just, some teenager's just run himself over a cliff or into a tree, and the family is devastated, because they know, even before they hear it from the doctor, that there is probably no hope. You have to be selective in using and knowing when to mostly you just listen. But if there's an opening where they want some encouragement and they don't have any spiritual faith to fall back on, one of these stories, however brief, you say, I was talking to a patient the other day. His heart had stopped on the operating table, and he came back with this story. And then I tell them the story.
Mm-hmm.
It would open things up a lot for them, open up hope for them,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that they hadn't even thought was possible before.
Yeah,
So
that's
that's
interesting.
why I think chaplains should be much more cognizant of the power of the near-death experience stories.
Oh yeah, I agree. And the thing is, I guess as a chaplain, and you can't really encroach on someone's religion, but an NDE experience is not a religious thing, right? It's just, it is. It's a story. It's what happened.
It is, and when you've had one, you know that it's real. It's not a matter of faith; it's a matter of knowing that it's real, and that
Yeah.
these things are not. Some people may make up these stories, but there'd be very, very few of them. Most all of them seem incredibly genuine to me.
Yeah. You touched on something earlier. You talked about like the fear of like ceasing to exist. And I interviewed Kelvin Chin last week of his book, Overcoming the Fear of Death. And one of the belief systems that some people have, of course, about death is that there's nothing after that, right? But we were talking about how, in fact, rationally speaking, that should not be a fear. You shouldn't fear not existing, but I think it's a very natural thing. I think humans, we want to continue, we want to go on, we feel like that gives our lives meaning and purpose, and so I think the NDE can give people that hope even without the the religious aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you think of all the experience that we live through in our lives, all of the things that we learn, the things that we share, the development, the maturing of love, it seems like all of that should not be lost when somebody dies.
Yeah.
Back in September, my sister died. She was 4 years younger than me. Wonderful lady. She had worked for peace for years. She was a Quaker. She went to China. She went on peace missions. She was a gardener, and she planted a whole hillside full of flowers, but right below her house, little house she had in Brackenridge, PA.
Hmm.
Raised kids. The kids have turned out wonderfully. And you think, how could all of that just disappear How could that just come to an end? And I was actually at an IANDS conference in King of Prussia when I got word that she died, and we had a meditation. A fellow named Peter Panagore, who you probably should talk to sometime if you
I
have.
know Peter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
He's great. He's a good friend. We're both here together in Maine, and anyway, he was doing a meditation that Sunday morning, and I knew Anne was just sitting right next to me.
Mm-hmm.
My sister was there. So when you know those things, it makes a huge difference. And little things happen all the time. I remember one time when I was just sitting in the cafeteria at the hospital, nobody anywhere near me eating a sandwich, and suddenly I felt this hand on my shoulder, and I turned around and saw no one there, but I knew who it was. It was a woman named Sarah who was dying of cancer, and she was just saying goodbye, put her hand on my shoulder. And
wow.
Later I found out that she had died just at that moment and was passing through the cafeteria on her way to wherever. So
wow, that's incredible. So as a chaplain, you had some of those experiences sitting with people that were transitioning.
Yeah, I can tell you a really good one and a really bad one if you're interested.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, let me do the bad one first to get it out of the way.
Yeah.
I was with a family who a man was dying of cancer. He'd been given tons of morphine, but he was still in tremendous pain, and it was mostly psychological pain, I think. And everyone was upset. His family was screaming. They're screaming at each other. He was screaming at them. When he died, I felt him try to move into my body. It was like an icy, cold, horrible, nauseating feeling, actually. And I said to the family, I was just standing by the door. I said, excuse me, I gotta leave. And I went out into the hall, and I knew what was going on here. And I said, you can't come in here. This is not what you want to do. Go look into the light. There are beings around you right now who will help you, will guide you, will take you to where you need to go. But you can't be in here with me. And then it went away right away.
Wow.
That was the worst. It only happened once in 15 years. And I'm really glad that it didn't happen again. The really good experience was in a room where this great grandfather actually was dying. All the generations everyone was with him, and they were all saying, "We love you. Don't worry about us. We'll be okay. Don't don't wait for us, or don't." I don't know. I'm looking for the phrase that says, "We let you go. We give you permission to go." That phrased in lots of different ways. All of them, from the children to the great grandchildren, who were actually babies and probably didn't articulate much of anything, but they were all. I mean, the room was full of love. When he died, and I don't know if the rest of the family felt this or not, but I felt like the room was that there was just this golden light, and with substance to it. It was almost like somebody had emptied a huge jar of honey onto the room. The color of gold, the color of honey, the feeling of a tangible feeling to it, not just like light, but light plus weight. And it was God's love. It was such a blessing. I don't know if it was being generated by the man dying, by the family, or by God just coming to get this guy. But it was so powerful and so rewarding. I've never forgotten it. I mean, it's really, when I get depressed, I think about that. I think about the Holy Spirit really embodied at that moment, and that it's there. So anyway, that was my best experience of being with someone who was dying. And then there've been miracles too.
You tell me about those. Yeah.
Yeah. There were some stories about from nurses. One nurse who said she had been she had a patient who was very unhappy, very miserable, and complaining all the time. And she came in one morning, and he said, and he was cheerful. He was happy. He said, "My brother came to see me, and he's going to take me home." And the nurse said, "Well, I thought you told me your brother had died." And he said, "Oh, he did. But tomorrow he's coming. He said he'd be here at 1:00. Could you be here? Will you sit with me when he comes?" And she said, "Well, you're not that sick. You're not going to die." She got what he was saying.
Mm-hmm.
But she was there, and she said at 1:00, he raised his arms, this big smile on his face. He was looking at someone she couldn't see, and he was gone. Another one, another favorite story of mine is the nurse who said she had a patient who wanted to die, did not want to be resuscitated, had signed all the documents saying, "Do not resuscitate." But she loved this woman so much that when the alarm went off, that she'd stopped breathing. The nurse came running down the hall because she was probably just out of impulse going to do CPR on the woman. She said she got knocked flat on her back in the hallway. And not only that, she could not get up. It was like there was a heavy weight pressing down on her.
Oh, wow.
And she was held there until it was too late to do anything. And she thought she really did want to die. And she was telling me, she was saying, "Don't interfere with this death of mine. This is something that I need, that I want."
Yeah, that is. Yeah, and these things happen. I was talking with someone yesterday. She's a death doula, and she's also happens to be a medium. So it's Deborah Diamond. She's got a great book out about Diary of a Death Doula. But we were talking about these. Someone calls her book a series of extraordinary events. And when I was saying to her last night, I said it's not really so much extraordinary events as they're ordinary events that you've seen through an extraordinary lens. And I think these things happen a lot more often than people realize, and especially with near-death experiences, a lot of people are ashamed to share their experiences for fear of being thought crazy, or if they might think it goes against their faith. And so it's good that people are starting to be able to share those things. And there's organizations like IANDS where people can come together and feel comfortable sharing. And I attend our local IANDS meetings here myself because I love to hear the stories. But a lot of people coming into IANDS are like, "I'm scared to talk about it." It takes them a while to even talk about their experience.
That's what I love about doing my show, NDE Radio, so much, is that oftentimes, I will have guests on who've talked about it 100 times or 1,000 times, who've really grown comfortable with it. But it's really nice when you can get someone who can say, "Honestly, I've never really told this to anyone before. Now I'm telling 10,000 people on the air," because it's so powerful. When you're first finally expressing it, with all the doubts and all of the concerns and all of the amazement that people bring to these stories. So it's been very rewarding for me. I just volunteered to do this for IANDS, but I've been doing it now for over 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
We have, I think, 320 shows in the archives that people can go in and listen to. So if any of your listeners are interested in hearing near-death experience stories from the horse's mouth, as it were. In fact, we've even had some stories about animal lives and past lives. So that's a possibility too.
So how do we find the podcast?
Oh, just go to nderadio.org.
Okay.
It'll come right up. Just Google that, or
Okay.
Lee Witting will bring it up usually too.
Okay, yeah, I didn't know that was there. I'll definitely listen to it because I actually found a podcast called, I think it's called Sam Reads Near-Death Experiences. And this guy just goes into the NDERF database and pulls out near-death experiences and reads them.
Yeah, I some weeks I've done that too. If I don't have a guest, or if I find it particularly good, IANDS for their members sends out a monthly email with an NDE story or two. And
Hmm.
often I'll just pick one up and read it on the air to let
Well,
people know the value of IANDS as an organization.
yeah, well, the value, it's like I said, I feel sometimes a little bit weird going to the meeting because I haven't had a near-death experience. So we go around the room and it's like I'm not an experiencer, but I'm just there for the stories.
Mm.
But I was reading Ken Ring's book. I can't remember the name of it right now. But it was all about near-death experiences, and in his research, he found out that just reading about near-death experiences enough can give you some of the effects that near-death experiencers have.
Right.
And the effects are profound. I mean, they're usually almost, I guess, always life changing.
Yeah. One just came to mind of a woman who had died in the hospital and then had been resuscitated. And I went in, and as I always did with somebody who's coded, I would say, well, did you see anything when you were on the other side? Just to make light of it. And most of the time, I would say close to 90% of the time, people would say, I don't remember anything.
Mm-hmm.
But those 10 to 15% of the time, one woman told me, yes, she said, and she was so happy that I asked because she was afraid to bring it up to anyone. She said, I saw my dad. He died 3 years ago. And she said, he was standing there and I could see behind him this beautiful light. She said, and I wanted to run into the light, but he said to me, I'm sorry, it's not your time yet. And she said, I was just like a little girl, and she was a woman in her 50s, I guess, maybe 60s. She said, it was just like I was a little girl trying to run around my dad, get around him to go into the light. But he grabbed me and he stopped me and he said, no, you've got to go back. And then I was back here in the hospital.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I used that story because it was such a simple one. Oh, countless times with other people
Mm-hmm.
and with amazing results.
Yeah, I think there is. I've been studying near death experiences for probably close to 20 years now. So I'm still fascinated by them, but I'm not. I get shocked, and when people haven't heard them before or heard someone talk about their experience and how real it is, especially the veridical ones, especially when people can come back and say, "Yeah, I saw this." I have a friend that had a near death experience and she saw her sister like several states away driving to the airport to get to her
Mhm.
and could even describe what she was wearing. So there's no way a skeptic could say, well, it's just a dream that you had.
Yeah. Um, Patients who are just have out of body experiences will tell stories like, they're lying dead on the operating table because something's gone wrong, and they're out of their body. They go through the wall. They're in the family room. They hear their family having this conversation about them.
Mm-hmm.
One said, I heard my grandmother say, I'm going to go outside and have a cigarette. She said, my grandmother hadn't smoked in years. So she took this as a real measure of how upset she was. And
Mm-hmm.
when she came back and she was back in her body and she told her grandmother, I heard you say you were going out to have a cigarette. Her grandmother was totally shocked,
Yeah.
but in a good way. It just says, that we are so much more than our bodies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, that's going to change not only the life of the person that had the experience, but probably the life of the grandmother and everybody else in the family that knows that experience is true and it's real. And it's something that we can't explain through normal physical senses.
Yeah, yeah. Um, there. Trying to think of anything I might add to how my NDE at 7 changed my life. And I think one of the things that was really motivating to my going to Europe when I had a 3-year-old and I was married and I
Yeah.
had a really good job with the Department of Welfare in New York in West Harlem helping people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I had this, I'd never been to Europe. I wanted to go, and my wife wanted to too, and we were able to save enough money to buy. Back then, you could buy a Volkswagen camper in Hamburg, Germany, for $2,500,
Oh, wow.
and so that's what we did. We went over on a coal freighter, uh, picked up the car, lived in the car for nearly a year, traveled all through Europe and the Middle East. We went down through Turkey, all the countries you couldn't go into now without worrying about, losing your life.
Right.
Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel. And everywhere we went, we would stop at religious sites, churches, mosques, pagan sites. There are lines, they call them ley lines, which I like to identify with because my name Lee is also, can be spelled Ley as well as Lee. And ley lines are magnetic strips that run across the face of the earth, and oftentimes you'll find pagan sites that where later the cathedrals were built, or churches or monasteries, because there's an energy to them. Sedona is probably the most famous in Arizona for having power spots, that where that you feel this magnetic energy just coming out of the earth, surging out of the earth, but in any event, that I think would probably not have been of any interest to me at all had I not had my NDE. That I was trying to make connections between what I felt was out of the body and the earth itself. It's like we sometimes put down the fact that we're physical beings because we suddenly recognize our spiritual nature. But we were created and put into a garden, which, we could say was Eden, but we could also say was the earth, an amazing, beautiful place that we're supposed to take care of, and with all sorts of magical qualities to it that we should be observant of and tending to and protecting instead of destroying it the way we are right now. And so those power sources coming out of the earth, those the places where people were compelled to build sharp cathedrals and that sort of thing. It was so interesting to me, and so just fascinating. And I'm sorry that people spend so much time looking at their cell phones now instead of just looking at a sunset or climbing a mountain, canoeing or just traveling the way we did when I was young.
Yeah. Well, talk to me about chaplaincy versus religion. You just retired recently as a chaplain, and I think a lot of us don't really understand what a chaplain is, right? Like you said, they call in a chaplain, and people say, "I'm not religious."
Right. Some chaplains are tied up with their own particular faith, and that I take to be a serious mistake, unless you're only going to be visiting Lutheran patients in a hospital, which would be one in in 1,000. You have to be open to all points of view. And fortunately, I'd had a Protestant background growing up. Then I'd had a Catholic background growing up. Then I was, during the Vietnam War, I was with the Quakers, and we were protesting. We were involved in civil rights and also in fighting the Vietnam War. Trying to bring that to an end. The Quaker faith is one where you all get together in a room and you sit quietly. It's meditation. It's not Eastern, but it's meditation. And it was founded by George Fox, a mystic, who said, we all have a spark of God in us. And once in a while, someone feels moved by that spark to stand up and say something. But for the most part, it's a silent worship. Quakers and chaplains have a lot in common, because to be a good chaplain, you should keep your mouth shut most of the time and just go in, introduce yourself, and say, "Well, how are you feeling?" You're an amateur psychologist with a spiritual approach to things, and you try to, without throwing religion at them in any way, try to draw them out to the point where they're not so hung up with their bodies, because when you're in the hospital, if something is failing, some part of your body is giving you a lot of trouble, and you want to get them out of that for a moment, and not by just giving them a painkiller, but by bringing them to a bigger sense of themselves. And so if you can draw them out and get them to talking about these things, it's amazing how things will ultimately go in the same direction. even, I mean, from Catholics to atheists, the spiritual side of us tend to ultimately lead to the same kind of conversations.
Really?
It's pretty amazing. You know, when an atheist has a near-death experience, it's quite an event, because you know, they are convinced, they are totally sold on the idea that there's nothing past this lifetime, and when they come back, they have a lot to account for in their own, you know, previous thinking, and it's always fun to talk to someone like that.
Yeah.
See what they think.
So have you had any atheists on the show that you can remember who might have had an experience like that?
I've had people who were atheists who, of course, at this point, the changes happened, you know.
True.
Yeah, I haven't had somebody who was an atheist 3 days ago and is suddenly there to talk to me about it. But in the hospital, I had some people like that. Other chaplains, I was working with 2 other chaplains. One of them also encountered near-death experience stories a lot. The other one said he never heard a near-death experience story. And I thought, what's going on here? I think you have to be open to the possibility to even hear a reference like that. And so many people have been turned off when their doctors or their nurses or a family member says, "Oh, that was just a dream," or "You just hallucinated that," or "That was the anesthesia talking." That's, you know, or "Don't say anything like that, you'll scare your mother." Those things really tend to keep people quiet for a long time. You know, they don't. Okay, I figured out that nobody wants to hear this story, so I'll just keep it to myself. So I think that accounts for a lot of stories that only start to get talked about 20 years later.
Yeah, you know, it's just, and not having gone through that, it's really hard for me to relate to that, because I've heard people say that. You know, I had this experience 20 or 30 years ago. I remember it like it was yesterday, and I've never told anybody. And I think that NDE experiences, my personal belief, that they're not just for the experiencer, they're for the rest of us too. Because even though they're highly individualized, the lessons that they come back with are for everybody. They're universal lessons, with, again, individualized to the person having the experience.
Let me ask, because I gathered from your own the bio that you posted that the death of your daughter put you on the path you're on.
Well, you know, I actually, ironically, I had an extreme fear of death from the time I was a teenager, and I just knew I was going to die young. So that is really, and an evangelical, I should say Pentecostal background, this fear of this guy that was going to send me to hell. That's what really put me on the path. Ironically, coincidentally, whatever you want to call it, my daughter did pass suddenly at the age of 15. But by the time she had passed, I had been studying near-death experiences for probably 15 or 20 years. So I was preparing for my own death, not expecting it to be, you know, her that passed. What her passing would have changed was, it made me more, I wanted to share this with everybody, because I had been studying it all for myself and taking it all in. And even my wife wasn't really involved in what I was doing. But after Shayna passed, you know, we both said, okay, we need to find out more about this. And as I did, I was like, okay, now I need to share this with other people, so people don't have to go through what I went through. So people don't have to fear, you know, first it was me fearing hell, and then it was me feeling, you know, saying, well, maybe there is no God, because the Bible didn't make sense the way it was taught to me. So maybe all of it was made up, and, you know, I am just an accident. And that's just a little bit more satisfying than thinking you're going to be eternally tortured. So for me, that was kind of the path. And I feel like with Shayna's passing, that was part of our soul plan. I believe that was planned out. And so that put me to where I am now, where I want to share what I've learned. I mean, it's been 20 plus years. I've been looking at all this stuff and trying to understand and trying to figure it out. And it makes me very sad. I think really one of the biggest problems we have in our world right now is people not knowing who they are, what they are, what we are.
Do you feel like she is encouraging you in your work?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Everything,
She's with you doing this.
everything I do for her. Yeah. She's
But
with me all the time.
but she's probably giving you some guidance as well.
Well, yeah, I've talked to several mediums, and Shayna takes credit for everything. She's given me guidance. She was a very good writer, and I think I'm a decent writer. And she's like, I'm a better writer than you are. So yeah, she definitely is encouraging me. And like I said, for me, I feel like this was the path that we chose together.
Yeah.
And it was her destiny to leave early this time. And that, it's still hard, but it brings some sense of comfort, and more importantly, brings a sense of purpose, and a little bit of order, I guess, to the madness.
Well, but it's good to know that, isn't it?
It is. It's very comforting to know that. I work with a lot of parents, and especially because when a child passes, it's out of order. It's not the way things are supposed to go. So I think it's especially devastating because it just seems wrong. And as parents, we're supposed to be there to protect them, and we have these visions for their lives that they're going to do this and this and this. So it's really hard to get over the fact that we think they're missing things. But it is comforting to know that, because it's better than the alternative to think she's just gone. That she was here yesterday, now she's disappeared. And when I think about her passing, I don't think of it as her passing. I think of it as her transcending, not even transitioning. She stepped out of her body from this reality to a bigger, greater reality, and it's still very much part of our lives, part of my life every day.
Yeah, I don't think we lose touch with the people we love and the earth and the places we visit. I mean, I certainly believe in ghosts. I've encountered them from time to time, and oftentimes they are products of an addiction. I mean, they've bonded with either another person or a location. The so-called haunted house, which we lived in when we moved to Maine. We bought a farmhouse. It was the man had,
Really?
the man had been in the Civil War. He'd come home with a bad wound. He'd been shot in the throat. He'd been in a Southern prisoner of war camp, and I don't know how he survived, but even that. But anyway, he built his farmhouse, started a family, but he was continually bothered by this pain. In fact, we found out in the backyard where they used to dump all their garbage, because nobody took garbage to a dump back in those days. Little bottles that said cocaine on the side.
Mm-hmm.
And you could go to the pharmacy and buy cocaine-based drugs. Anyway, one day his family went down to the beach to have a picnic, and he just went out on the back porch and killed himself.
Wow.
And his ghost had been there ever since. When we bought the farmhouse, it hadn't been lived in 20 years. It was quite a wreck at that point. And we'd hear doors opening and closing and footsteps upstairs, and the hair on the back of the dog's neck would go up, and,
wow.
and he'd bark. And then one day we had a friend, a violinist named Heifetz, but not the Heifetz, Danny Heifetz, who had been friends with us when we lived in Philadelphia, had gone to music school there. And he came for a visit, and he was upstairs practicing the violin, which he did faithfully every day. He said he came downstairs after he'd played a piece, Bach Chaconne. He said, the most amazing thing happened. He said, I was playing, and all of a sudden the face of this old man appeared, just floating in the air. And we said, oh, that's Mr. Webster. That's the fellow who built the house. And he said, and I said, Danny said, I didn't know what to do. So I just kept on playing until it was done, because that's how you do it when you've got an audience.
Yeah.
And when he finished playing, the face faded away. And after that, we didn't hear anything more from Mr. Webster. So music could be a way of transitioning along with other things as well.
Yeah, the whole thing about ghosts, and that's one of the things that's still a mystery to me, I guess. Is it like a leftover energy? Is it like I've heard people say maybe it's an energetic kind of echo or something. But we also know that time is different on the other side. So if someone does feel like they're stuck for many, many years, from that perspective, it may not it's not the same. We don't know exactly how it is, but we know it's not the same.
There's a board member who's no longer a board member at IANDS who teaches classes in New York City and how to leave your body. And one of the things that they do as a group, they are missionaries to the world of ghosts.
Wow. Okay.
They said you can go into a bar and be standing at the bar drinking, and the ghost will be standing right next to you, imitating your motion, bringing a ghostly glass to a ghostly mouth, trying to recapture the essence of their addiction. That's addicted. When you're still addicted at the point of death, and you carry on doing that sort of thing. And they would go to them and they'd say, you don't have to stay here. You don't have to be stuck in a bar room. I mean, look around, there are friends, there are family, they would pray for them, and they would liberate them.
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting to think, well, the good thing is, they can go to the light and become free and break through that addiction.
Yeah.
Which
that decision is really up to them.
Yeah.
They have to make the move, and I take that to be like the Catholic idea of purgatory, where you're sort of stuck, trying to make an act of contrition for your sins. That's probably the world of ghosts.
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, talking to people in this field, I talk to some mediums, particularly. Some will say, okay, well, once you die, there are no more negative emotions. You're free and you're happy, and there's no sadness, there's no addiction, there's no whatever. And then others say, when we die, we essentially stay the same person that we were. And if you choose to hold on to those negative things, what we call negative, or the addictions, that you can, but I think maybe the truth is somewhere kind of in between. Maybe it's a self-imposed kind of thing, where people say they don't feel like they deserve to move on to that next level, and they do need a little bit of encouragement to say it's okay. You can let go of this now. You can move on.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is. It's some people just say, I was too bad a person. They're judging themselves.
Exactly.
Or they're taking the message from the life review and taking it too seriously, taking it to heart. I mean, I do also believe in reincarnation, and I'm sure we carry some karma with us, but I think it's also a fresh start. We get a chance to do it right the next time. How many of us do it right the next time? I don't know. Yeah. we may still fall back into old patterns, but I guess that's there was a story from Plato about the soldier named Have you ever heard that?
I haven't heard that, no.
Okay, the last book of Plato's Republic. This is 400 BC. This is long before Jesus. He talks about the soldier who is out on the battlefield with his buddies, and they're in a battle, and they're killed, and their bodies are brought back to be burned on a funeral pyre. And just before they light the fire into this one soldier, he sits up and he says, "I've been sent back to tell you what happens when we die." That I was when we were killed, we were all crossing this field together. He said, it was beautiful, beautiful field. We came to a place of judgment. He said there were judges who would send us either up to a place to be rewarded or down to a place to be punished. But it was just a temporary thing. And after the rewarded and the punished went through that experience, they met in a field and they talked to one another about what had happened to them, and how they'd gone up or gone down, and then they drink. They go on from there and they drink from. No, there's one more step, and that was actually the point of why I was telling you this story. They are getting ready for their next life, and they get a choice of what kind of life they're going to live. They can choose to be poor or rich. They can choose to be, one race or another race. They get to choose some aspects of their life, but the rest of their life is it's a toss of the dice. It's a it's fate. It's something is imposed on them that they have no choice about. So they get to choose some aspects of their life, but other aspects of their life are chosen for them.
Interesting.
Then they drink from this river of forgetfulness, and then they're back being reborn.
Back and doing it all over again.
Back to do it again. Yeah.
Well, I want to ask you, we have a few minutes left. I want to talk to you about your book, Beneath the Phoenix Door. It's a novel?
It's a novel. I wrote it actually when I was in seminary. I wrote it as a project maybe 20 years ago. I started it and wrote about 200 pages as an independent study project involving near-death experience and two teachers from the seminary who are commissioned to find the Garden of Eden. And this is an adventure that they go on. I went back 2 years ago, I picked it up and I said, this isn't half bad. I ought to do something with it. So I had to modernize some of the stuff. I mean, there were no cell phones back when I wrote it, and, a guy can't find a payphone. So, the things that I had to
age really fast.
I had to fix, right? But the basic plot and the way Eden and the fate of the earth are connected in this book, I think are really important.
Wow.
And so it's a novel, but it's got some interesting messages. I go into many different religions. There's talk about on their way to find Eden, I take them through Rosalind Chapel, the Templars. They go to the real Mount Sinai, which is in Saudi Arabia, and they're in the temple underground. There's a temple under the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and where it's been said, although a lot of people deny it, that the Ark of the Covenant has been discovered and it's actually being used in the ceremonies again. So we go through a lot of this stuff, and then finally they find that they do make, spoiler alert, they make it into Eden, and that's a whole different trip with good and evil, Satan and God.
Wow, and, sounds fascinating. So when do you think that'll be out?
Probably 2 months.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. It's actually set. I just have to, and I'll self-publish it, but it'll be available on Amazon.
Cool. I don't typically have time to read fiction because I'm always reading near-death experiences and books by mediums and stuff like that. But I have to pick that one up. Yeah,
you might find the teacher, Jacob, his name is motivated by a near-death experience to start with. He's sort of a contemporary seminaries are often very liberal, and sometimes they study the texts like texts and have with no faith involved.
Exactly.
I wrote this original book for a teacher who was like that, who when we studied Paul, he'd never talk about all of Paul's revelations about faith. He was only talking about where he traveled and what was happening to him and when he nearly drowned and stuff like that. So anyway, but a near-death experience has an amazing ability to wake people up to what's real.
Speaking of that, just reminds me as an aside, I remember reading something several years ago about how many pastors are actually atheists. Going through seminary, they actually lose their faith. So they study the Bible as a text and they preach it every Sunday, but they don't really believe it.
It's true. Yeah. It's very sad. I was in a class. I would make a faith statement in class, knowing, and drawing on not talking about my near-death experience, but drawing on the influence that had in my life. People would look at me like I was crazy, and they're in seminary, for God's sake.
Yeah. Well, it's the whole thing about NDEs. People say, "Oh, I don't believe in NDEs because I'm a Christian." It's like, wait a minute, what do you mean?
Oh, well, that's a whole other story we probably don't have time for, but it's terrible the way religion is so afraid organized religion fears near-death experience and personal mystical experiences of any kind because it saps their authority.
Yeah, exactly. I was having a discussion with a friend who's evangelical, and we were talking about NDEs. And I was this was before I started the podcast, I think, but I talked to a lot of people that had NDEs, and I said, Paul had an NDE. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, Paul on the road to Damascus saw a bright light, heard a voice, fell to his knees, was blinded, all that stuff. That was an NDE. That was, out of body experience." And then he had another experience. He said, "I was praying and I was in the third heaven." And I said, so if I believe that, and I do, why wouldn't I believe Mary last week when she told me she had an NDE and saw a light and heard a voice?
I know. The Congregationalists for a while had a statement that they like to put out in the bulletins and so forth, saying God is still talking. I think it was ... But when God's trying to talk through us the way he talked through Paul, they didn't want to hear it.
Right.
So, and the Catholics, I mean, you've got to die before your visions count for anything in the Catholic Church. The Catholic mystics who saw amazing things in visions and probably in some near-death experiences, they were shut down until finally they died, and then the church would say, well, maybe there was something to this after all. Let's make them a saint.
Yeah, exactly.
When in fact we're all saints.
Yeah, well, I believe that too. And again, that's not something that religion wants to tell us, right? We've got to earn it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Lee, I really appreciate you doing this. Anything you'd like to say before we wrap up today?
Well, just that I think, from what I understand, you're doing very important work. You're being a chaplain yourself to a lot of people by presenting this sort of material. And I want to congratulate you and encourage you. And there is nothing more powerful than empathy. And when you have gone through painful circumstances yourself and can relate to other people's painful circumstances, it's very, very healing. So
I'd like to make some purpose out of it. So, whenever I'm doing these, I have a second monitor over here. My wife, my two daughters are on it, and Shane is always staring right at me. So she's always putting pressure on me. Believe me, she doesn't let me slack out.
Well, my best to Shane. I tell her to keep up the good work.
So I want to tell everybody where you can reach Lee. It's nderadio.org. That's NDE as in near death experience, radio.org.
Yep.
And you can find the podcast there, and I'm going to subscribe.
Good. Doesn't cost a thing. Just we're on live Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern for half an hour. Mm-hmm. But if you can't catch it, then all the shows go up by the afternoon. They're there, and there's a brief description of each one. And as I said, there's something like 322 of them to date. So you can spend a lot of time listening to NDE Radio if you want to. Yeah, it'll change your life, I guarantee it. Lee, thanks a lot. Well, thank you, Brian.
Have a great day.
You too. Thanks.
Hey, thanks for watching. Before you leave, I'd like to just remind you, you can always find me at www.grief2growth.com. That's grief, numeral 2, growth.com. And you can schedule a free half-hour consultation if you'd like. Also, before you leave, please click on the like button here, click on subscribe, and click on the bell. By clicking like, YouTube will show the video to more people, and by subscribing and clicking the bell, you'll be notified when I release new material. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.